It was close to midnight when Colonel Rachel Tran finally turned onto the narrow state highway just outside Toledo, Ohio. The conference had run longer than expected, and after 3 days of nonstop briefings, policy panels, and media flashbulbs, all she wanted was silence. Her government-issued SUV hummed steadily beneath her fingers, headlights cutting a clean path through the darkness, like a promise of rest. The dashboard clock blinked 11:47 p.m. Home was still an hour away. Rachel wasn't in uniform, but the bearing never left her. Even in civilian clothes, neatly pressed slacks, a soft blouse, her hair tied back in a no-nonsense knot, she moved like someone who had stood in deserts and decision rooms, someone who had seen war, buried soldiers, and briefed presidents without once raising her voice. The road was nearly empty. A lone 18-wheeler lumbered past in the opposite lane. Then came the lights.
Red, blue, red, blue.
She caught the flash in her rearview mirror just as the patrol car came roaring up behind her, lights spinning like a siren scream. Rachel frowned, not confused, but cautious. She'd been going 5 under the speed limit. No sudden swerves. No distractions. She eased the vehicle to the shoulder, signaled as protocol dictated, hands at 10 and 2 on the wheel. The night air thickened. Boots crunched gravel. The officer approached slowly, methodically, but something about the rhythm of his stride rang loud in Rachel's instincts. She had read that gait before, in Men Who Had Something to Prove. His flashlight beam cut across her dashboard, then her face, and lingered longer than necessary. "License and registration," he barked. Rachel offered both, her tone even, polite. "Officer, may I ask what this stop is about?" "You were weaving," he snapped. "Looked like you were under the influence." She blinked. "I haven't had a drink in over 20 years. He ignored her, eyes narrowing. "Step out of the vehicle." There was no slur in her voice. No delay in her movements. No open containers, no bloodshot eyes, no cause. But the badge on his chest gleamed like armor, and he wore it not like a protector of peace, but like a man carrying a weapon in plain sight. Rachel complied. She stepped out with grace that felt like defiance, silent, calm. Too composed to be guilty. He ordered her to take a field sobriety test. She passed, unsurprisingly. Still, he handed her a citation for failure to maintain lane, his pen digging too hard into the paper, the anger in his hands louder than anything he said aloud.
She didn't argue.
She took the paper, folded it carefully, and slid it into her coat pocket. He didn't know her name.
Didn't ask.
Didn't recognize the quiet thunder behind her posture, the unspoken years in her eyes. To him, she was just another woman on a back road. Asian. Alone. Passive enough not to challenge him, until the recording started. She had turned her phone's camera on quietly when he ordered her out. Not to provoke. To remember. To ensure the truth had a witness that wouldn't blink. And now it did. As he turned and strutted back to his cruiser, satisfied with his small performance of authority, Rachel stood by the roadside in the chill wind, watching his taillights fade like a lie driving away. She didn't chase after him. She didn't raise her voice. But behind her stillness, something ancient stirred. Discipline forged by battlefields, patience tempered by war, and the cold precision of a woman who had faced generals and graves and never once needed to shout to be heard. The stop was over, but the reckoning had just begun. The morning after the stop, Rachel Tran sat at her kitchen table, the untouched coffee cooling beside her as sunlight crept over the edge of the counter. Her home was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses on the chest like a question left unanswered. The citation from the night before lay on the table, next to the printed transcript from her phone's video. She had replayed it at least 5 times. Not out of disbelief. She had seen far worse in her lifetime, but because this time it was personal. This time it was her. For 30 years, she had served a country that now watched its defenders with indifference. She had led missions with no room for error, briefed operations where one wrong word meant casualties. She had taught younger officers to wield power with the discipline of a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. But the man who stopped her last night didn't understand power. He only understood permission. and someone somewhere had given him too much of it. The officer's name was Officer Craig Blanton. A 2-year badge, a spotless record on paper, and a reputation in the area that rode the edge of fear. Not respect.
Fear.
She made a quiet call to a retired federal marshal she had once trained. 10 minutes later, she had Blanton's file, thin, but dirty in the margins. Complaints dismissed. Body cam footage mysteriously corrupted. Traffic stops with one demographic showing up again and again. Patterns buried beneath bureaucracy. Rachel read it all with the same composure she used to review after-action reports from combat zones. The names were different, the casualties quieter. But the damage, the trauma, the fear, it echoed the same. She didn't call a lawyer. She called someone else. Major Elijah Pierce. Once her subordinate. Now a high-level agent within the DOJ's Civil Rights Division. Decorated, disillusioned, and dangerous when silent. He answered on the first ring. Rachel. I need a favor, she said. And I need your silence until it's done. By the end of the day, an internal review request was filed through back channels, flagged with language that didn't raise alarms, but made certain people pay attention. Not publicly. Not yet. This was the kind of operation Rachel knew best. Invisible, legal, irreversible. Meanwhile, Officer Blanton continued his routine. His boots hit the ground with the same arrogance. His eyes scanned women of color with the same suspicion. He handed out warnings like confetti, convinced he was untouchable because no one had ever told him otherwise. The small-town sheriff liked him because he made quotas. The locals feared him because he didn't smile. And the system ignored him because no one had bled, yet. But Rachel understood something Blanton didn't. Power, when left unchallenged, always escalates. That night, as she sat again in the dim light of her kitchen, she thought not of vengeance, but of accountability, of all the quiet women and men who had swallowed rage so they could survive. She thought of her parents, immigrants who never once raised their voice in this country, who told her to be twice as good and half as loud. She thought of the cadets she had mentored, the women she had defended, the names on the walls of Arlington. She thought of the weight of a uniform and the disgrace of those who wore badges without honor. Power was never the enemy. It was restraint that made it noble. And in the absence of restraint, even a badge could become a weapon more dangerous than any rifle. She pressed print. The full internal memo. The video. The citations from 3 other drivers, all women. All Asian. All stopped within 20 miles of each other in the past 90 days. The dossier was ready. She sealed the envelope with steady hands. Then, without drama or fury, she stood, tall, unshaken, and walked it to her mailbox. The reckoning had already begun. Now it had a trail. In the days that followed, the envelope Rachel mailed began its quiet journey through the gears of federal oversight. No one saw it on the morning news. No headlines screamed justice. But inside a modest office in Washington, D.C., a woman named Marissa Kim, an internal affairs investigator with a photographic memory and a history of never backing down, opened the packet and didn't look away. She read the complaint once, then again, then a third time, slower. Rachel Tran's name didn't ring bells in the civilian world, but to Marissa, who had once interned under a retired general who still called Rachel the Storm in Silk, the name was gospel. And if someone like Rachel had taken the time to write this much, something wasn't just wrong. It was systemically broken. The investigation didn't begin with Officer Blanton. It began with the shield he wore. Blanton's badge had been issued through a department that, on paper, looked well managed. Average response times, no major lawsuits in recent years, annual audits all passing. But Marissa had long learned how to read what wasn't in the paperwork. The silences between the lines. The patterns that didn't need to be written down to be real. She sent quiet requests to state databases. She ran search queries not by names, but by race, gender, and location of traffic stops over the past year. What she found confirmed what Rachel had feared. Officer Blanton was a symptom. The sickness was deeper. Blanton's precinct had no active body cam monitoring system. Dash cam footage was archived inconsistently, with entire weeks missing. Internal complaint forms were reviewed by the same officer who signed off on his performance evaluations. 3 sergeants rotated through administrative roles every 4 months, leaving no real oversight or accountability. It wasn't chaos. It was calculated fog. But it was when Marissa pulled disciplinary records from the sheriff's department that something shifted from troubling to explosive. 3 officers under Blanton's direct command had prior complaints for excessive force, but the incidents were buried in peer-to-peer resolution reports. One victim had been a high school teacher pulled over on suspicion of a broken taillight. She had been pushed against her car for asking why she was being detained. No charges were filed. No internal reprimand was issued. The report listed her as argumentative and erratic. Marissa found her contact information. The woman had moved out of state. And suddenly, this wasn't just about a stop on a highway. It was about a culture that thrived on impunity. Rachel, meanwhile, didn't wait for justice to call her back. She knew better than to expect immediacy. But she also knew that silence was never neutral. It could be weaponized by those who feared exposure and by those who waited to act without warning.
So she moved ahead.
One evening, seated at her desk surrounded by half-read books and medals she no longer displayed, she began drafting an op-ed. Not a rant, a reflection, titled, "The Badge I Trusted and the One That Failed Me."
It wasn't just about Blanton.
It was about a system that trained soldiers with precision but allowed civilian policing to operate on ego and guesswork. She wrote about restraint, about honor, about the difference between fear-based control and principled authority. She didn't name the officer. Not yet. But the article struck nerves when it was quietly published online through a private veterans policy forum. Within hours, dozens of former officers, commanders, and even federal agents left comments, not public endorsements, but encrypted replies. A kind of digital salute. A few asked for details. A few offered help. And a few, those who had faced similar humiliations, just wrote, "I understand." Back in Toledo, Blanton hadn't yet noticed the quiet tide shifting beneath him. He still made his rounds, still walked into diners like a man who mistook silence for obedience. But in the police station's internal messaging system, there were murmurs. A strange audit request had come down from the state. The sheriff's office was reviewing stop-and-search protocol. Someone had filed a Freedom of Information Act request for the past 3 months of citation records. Blanton joked about it at lunch. Some Karen trying to make a name for herself. But in Washington, Marissa Kim wasn't laughing. She had assembled a task team. Not loud, not branded. Just a network of professionals who had been waiting for a case like this to justify doing what their conscience had been urging for years. The badge was supposed to be a covenant. It had become a costume. And the man who wore it, without honor, without restraint, without humility, had just been seen. Rachel didn't want revenge. She wanted recalibration. She wanted to remind this country that the uniform itself meant nothing if the character behind it was corrupt. That a badge without self-control was just a permission slip for damage. And that silence, when cloaked in professionalism, could be more devastating than any outburst. The storm hadn't arrived, but the pressure in the air was changing. And somewhere, deep within the fibers of a fraying institution, the badge behind the behavior had begun to crack. The retaliation didn't come in the form of loud accusations or official letters. It came the way fear always arrives when it has power on its side, quietly, in the spaces where dignity used to live. 3 days after the op-ed circulated among the veteran and policy circles, Rachel Tran noticed her mail arriving late, some of it already opened. Her neighbors, once friendly in passing, began to avoid eye contact. The local coffee shop she'd gone to for years got suddenly curt with her order, forgetting her name, her drink, her face. It wasn't paranoia. It was orchestration.
Subtle.
Calculated. Meant to isolate. And then came the phone call. A soft, almost apologetic voice on the other end, pretending to be from a local insurance company. They claimed her vehicle registration had flagged inconsistencies. When she asked for a callback number, the line went dead. Within an hour, she found her car ticketed in her own driveway, for expired tags that were, in fact, current. A familiar patrol car passed slowly down her street as she removed the ticket, its windows dark, its silence heavier than any siren. It was Officer Blanton's patrol zone. He didn't need to say a word. The message was clear. This wasn't law enforcement. It was performance. Theater for control. And Rachel, for all her military background, understood what it meant to be targeted without bullets. Psychological warfare didn't always come in combat. Sometimes it came in the form of a cold stare from across a grocery aisle. Sometimes it was a supervisor's silence. And sometimes it wore a badge and smiled while filing false reports. She wasn't afraid, but she was disgusted. Because what Officer Blanton and his kind never understood was that power unchallenged becomes addiction. And like all addictions, it needs escalation to feel alive. Her phone rang again. This time it was Elijah. "Your name's on a local forum," he said. "Some fringe blogs calling you a race baiter. Says you fabricated the whole thing." Rachel didn't flinch. "Let them," she replied. "They're already losing ground." And they were. Because what Blanton and his allies failed to account for was that Rachel was not alone. She never had been. Veterans, policy officers, retired judges, people who had served with principle were now watching. Quietly.
Closely.
From afar. The more noise they made against her, the more attention they drew to themselves. And the more people began asking, why is a traffic stop provoking this much resistance? One night, Rachel opened her front door to find her trash can overturned, the lid cracked, its contents scattered with surgical care. Not vandalism. A message. She stood in the doorway for a long time, staring down at the mess with a soldier's silence, then calmly stepped outside. She put on gloves. She picked up each item, cleaned the street, reset the can. Not a word. Not a pause. And as she stood under the moonlight, a distant engine purred from the far end of the block, idle, observing. She looked straight at it. She wasn't hiding. She never had. What Blanton didn't understand, and what men like him rarely do, is that retaliation against someone like Rachel doesn't end the fight. It amplifies the truth. She had filed nothing official against him, made no public speech. She had only told the truth and allowed it to travel. And in response, they revealed exactly who they were, without needing help. Every passive-aggressive gesture, every indirect threat, they were writing her testimony for her. And she wasn't documenting it alone. The woman from D.C., Marissa Kim, had already assigned a shadow team. Local contacts were monitoring from a distance. Every false ticket, every phone call, every turn of the patrol car was being logged. Not for revenge. For record. For accountability. Rachel did not retaliate. She bore witness. Because the quiet retaliation that Blanton thought would isolate her had only confirmed everything she claimed. It showed his fragility, his dependency on fear. And more dangerously, it exposed the department's complicity. Because someone was letting him do this. Someone was watching, approving, or worse, encouraging it. Injustice always thinks it's stealthy. Until it's caught blinking in the open. Rachel's silence wasn't surrender. It was a preparation. Every day they tried to make her shrink, she grew quieter. And in that quiet, something began to build. Not anger, not vengeance, but gravity. The kind of moral weight that outlasts intimidation. The retaliation had begun. But it wasn't hers. It was theirs. And it was louder than they realized. The courthouse wasn't large. No marble columns or echoing halls. Just a rectangular building of beige brick, cracked tile, and cheap fluorescent lighting that flickered more often than not. But to Rachel Tran it felt like sacred ground, not because it was grand, but because it still held the possibility of truth. She arrived early. Not because she feared the proceedings, but because soldiers arrive early. Because being early is a form of readiness, a way to say I respect what this moment means. She wore black. Not to mourn, but to signal. This was not a performance. In the hallway outside the courtroom, the air was stale with bureaucracy. People moved with the deadened efficiency of routine, lawyers juggling folders, interns typing on phones, a janitor humming off-key. But Rachel noticed everything. The nervous glances. The deputy who looked her over twice, then avoided eye contact. The older woman sitting alone on a bench, lips pursed, eyes sharp, watching too carefully to be just another bystander. The hearing had been called quietly. On paper, it wasn't even about her. It was a procedural review of Officer Blanton's past conduct, triggered, officially, by an internal audit unrelated to her incident. The town needed the appearance of process, not the reality of accountability. But appearances have limits. And Rachel's name had been whispered into too many rooms by then. When Blanton entered the courtroom, he didn't look toward her. He walked like a man coached by union reps, stiff-necked and righteous. His lawyer followed, thin, pale, with that faintly sneering smile particular to men who have confused strategy with morality. The judge, a weary figure in his 60s, adjusted his glasses without looking up as the room settled. What followed wasn't theatrical. It was meticulous. A review officer from the state's Civilian Oversight Board began reading incident logs. At first, it sounded benign, just dates, places, names blurred for anonymity. But the pattern was unmistakable. Repeated stops of minority drivers. Multiple citations written in less than a minute. Unusual, almost impossible. Complaints filed, and then lost. Rachel's own incident was folded in like a final stone in a growing wall. Blanton's attorney objected often. He claimed hearsay, bias, procedural error. But each time, the oversight officer responded with quiet, crushing precision. This dashcam footage was archived out of order. This complainant was never contacted. This officer received commendation despite unresolved complaints. And then they played the audio. Rachel hadn't heard it since the night it happened. She sat still as the scratchy, muffled voice of Blanton came through, asking for license, registration. The subtle, condescending tone. The pause after she handed over her ID. The unmistakable shift when he realized who she was. Not just a woman. Not just Asian.
Not just quiet.
But a veteran. A combat medic. Someone who had seen more horror than he ever would. And that terrified him. The room was silent. Then came his words. Flat, cutting, unforgettable. So you think you're better than me? And Rachel remembered again. Not the fear, but the sorrow. That this was how low the bar had fallen. That the uniform no longer protected honor, only ego. The judge asked Rachel if she wished to speak. It wasn't required. She could have declined. But she stood. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't rise. It flowed, measured, patient, unflinching. She didn't speak about herself. She spoke about systems. About how power without conscience becomes infection. How silence from departments allows arrogance to fester into abuse. She said nothing cruel. Nothing exaggerated. Just facts, and the emotional truth they carried like shrapnel. I was not afraid that night, she said. I've seen men bleed out in sand, whispering for their mothers. I've seen children hold their breath beside minefields. What scared me, what still does, is that this man wears a badge and believes fear makes him effective. Blanton stared at the floor. The judge didn't make a ruling that day. It wasn't that kind of hearing. But the silence afterwards said more than a gavel ever could. Rachel walked out without applause. Without confrontation. Without even a glance back at Blanton. But something had shifted. Not because justice had been served, but because the illusion of invincibility had cracked. Outside, the sun was high. The sky indifferent. But in her chest, something settled. Not victory, not relief, but the quiet satisfaction of having stood up in a place that tried to look away. The courtroom hadn't healed anything, but it had exposed everything. And sometimes, that's where justice begins. Justice didn't arrive in a siren. It didn't wear a badge or deliver a verdict in front of flashing cameras. It came quietly, through the breath between days, through choices made in silence. And it didn't wear a uniform. Rachel Tran had stopped believing in uniforms a long time ago, not because she hated them, but because she knew what they could conceal. A month had passed since the courtroom. Officer Blanton was still on administrative leave, with pay. The department hadn't issued a formal statement. The mayor's office offered lukewarm platitudes about community trust and ongoing reviews. Rachel didn't expect more. She didn't want headlines. She wanted change, not for her, but for the next person pulled over for the color of their skin, the shape of their eyes, the steadiness of their voice when they refused to shrink. She had started meeting quietly with other veterans, people who had served in silence and returned to a country that barely looked up. They met in the back room of a church, in the second booth of a diner, in Rachel's living room with the curtains drawn halfway open. Some wore faded caps with unit patches. Some didn't say a word for the first hour. But when they did speak, the air shifted. There was Carla, who served in Fallujah and now taught public school, her voice soft but her stare unbreakable. There was Joe, who ran a mechanic shop and carried a photo of a friend who didn't make it home. And Elijah, steady as ever, sat at Rachel's right, hands folded as if in silent prayer. None of them came for revenge. They came to build something. A network. A line. They called it the Veterans Line. It wasn't official. It wasn't funded. But it was real. A living chain of people who had once taken oaths and still meant them, even if their country had forgotten how. Veterans who watched over traffic stops with body cams synced to private servers. Veterans who showed up at town halls not to shout but to sit quietly, uniform or not, and make sure someone was watching. Rachel never led. She only listened. But people followed. The first letter came folded inside an envelope with no return address. A young woman wrote about her brother, stopped and searched 6 times in 3 months. She said she didn't know who to trust. She ended with, "I saw you in the hearing. I just wanted you to know someone is still awake." Rachel kept that letter. Then came more. Not just stories of harm, but of hope. A sheriff from a neighboring county asking for guidance on retraining protocol. A rookie officer who said, "I want to be better than what I saw in the academy." A Black veteran from Mississippi offering to fund community patrol oversight teams, not to fight cops, but to keep them honest. It wasn't a revolution. It was a recalibration. Because what Rachel had proven without riots, without lawsuits, was that the uniform didn't grant justice. Only a conscience could do that. And conscience, like courage, couldn't be issued. It had to be chosen. One evening, as the sun sank low behind the bare trees, Rachel stood at the edge of the local park where she'd once seen Blanton cruise slowly past her house. She watched a father teach his son how to ride a bike. 2 teenagers laughed under the pavilion, one of them wearing a hoodie, shoulders relaxed. And further back, a squad car pulled into a spot near the trees. But this time, no one tensed. The officer didn't exit. He simply sat, engine off, hands visible on the wheel. Maybe he was watching. Or maybe he was learning. Rachel turned back toward her truck. She had stopped flinching at the sound of engines behind her. She had stopped rehearsing her rights before every trip to the store. Not because the system had changed, but because she had refused to disappear. Justice, she realized, was never a destination. It was a discipline. A long walk in borrowed shoes. It didn't wear medals or stand at a podium. It sat in the back row, silent, determined, waiting for someone, anyone, to speak with honesty when silence would be easier. As she drove away, the sky deepened to violet. The town passed by in slow vignettes. A boy walking his dog, a barber sweeping his front step, an old woman watching from her porch. Ordinary scenes, stitched together by the invisible hands of people who cared enough not to look away. Rachel didn't wear her old uniform anymore.
She didn't need to.
Because now, justice wore her face. And it didn't blink.